We begin today the Gemara on Daf Hey Yamid Beis, 7 lines up from the bottom of the Yamid where it says Lamemre de Kanya Lahu. So the Gemara here is in the middle of a discussion that Rish Lakish brought up the question regarding the din of the Mishnah. What does this mean that you have a carbon which is kosher, but for the chayva of the bailim it doesn't work anything for him? So Rabbi Lazar brought him an example that you see a carbon of a yeledes that after she passes away and the carbon is not needed for her obligation, the Yarshim can bring the carbon. So we see that a carbon is kosher to be brought even if it's not being used for the chayva, for the obligation of the owner. So now here what the Gemara is discussing is who says that the Yarshim don't have any use of this carbon for themselves. Maybe since what they're bringing here is the carbon oila of the Yeledes, that oila is mechaper not only for benegate to her birth, but it's also mechaper on a mitzvah saseh that a person is over on. So maybe for the Yarshim, this carbon will not be mechaper on any mitzvah saseh that they would be over on. So therefore this is not a good example to prove the idea that you have a carbon that's kosher without any use of it to the owner that's bringing the carbon. That's the question of the Gemara. So now, because of this question, the Gemara has another point that it gets into discussing here. Let's see. Zok the Gemara, now, based on what you're saying, that maybe this carbon of the inheritors, they use this carbon also to be mechaper for their own mitzvah saseh that they have to have a kapara for, but nala memre. Shall we say that means the kanya lohu, that they will acquire this carbon, and therefore the kapara of this oilag will work for a mitzvah saseh for them? If they're not acquiring this carbon, they're just bringing their mother's carbon, then it can't be a kapara for them. They don't even own it b'chlal. So if you're suggesting this idea that it's mechaper for their mitzvah saseh, so that means that they acquire it. But how could that be? Because Rabbi Yochanan said, Hiniach mincha l'shnei bonav. A person had a carbon mincha that he had designated to bring as a carbon. This is a flour carbon. And he passes away. And he has two sons that yarshan this. So Umeis, he passes away. Kreva, it could be still brought as a carbon. Ve'ein boy shutfis, and there's no partnership here. What's the relevance of partnership? So as Rashi brings from the Gemara and Menachos, one of the halachas by carbon mincha is there's no mincha for partners, because the pasuk by carbon mincha says v'nefesh kisakriv. Nefesh means one person. So now, if we're going to say that the children are yarshaning this, they become owners of this carbon mincha. So now they own it b'shutfis. If they own it b'shutvis, they can't bring it, as the Gemara spells out. If you're going to say that they acquire this, the Gemara itself brings the pasuk nefesh amar rachmane. The pasuk says the word nefesh, that only one person can bring a carbon mincha. So therefore over here, if we're saying that the children can bring the carbon mincha, what must be? That they're not kind of this. It still belongs to the father, and they're just bringing their father's carbon. Can't say that they're kind of. So how are we suggesting before to say that the children of this Yeledes that had a carbon are going to bring her oila and they are going to be kind of this? And therefore they could be mechaper for their mitzvah saseh. We see over here from what Rabbi Yochanan says that the children are not kind of this carbon mincha. There is no shutfis. But now the Gemara asks a contradiction. Rabbi Yochanan himself said something that seems to imply that the children are kind of the carbon. In fact, the Gemara, the children are not kind of this carbon. But Rabbi Yochanan himself said a few halachas. A person left a behemoth for a carbon and he died, and he left it for his children. He died and he left it for his children. Kreva. So this behemoth can be brought as a carbon. It's one din. And also ve'ein meimirin ba. The halacha of tumura does not apply there. When a person wants to exchange and say instead of this animal that's a carbon, another should be a carbon. And when you do that, what happens? It causes that this remains a carbon and the other also is a carbon. That's a din of tumura. So he says that this halacha of tumura, if they try to do it, it doesn't take effect. So now why not? What's the pshat over here? So if you're going to say that what happens is they actually acquire this carbon after the father passes away. So that would explain what Rabbi Yochanan is saying, that the din of tumura does not apply here. Why not? Because the havi lahu kishutfin. Because the children that are inheriting this are shutfin. Now the carbon belongs to the two children which are partners. What's the halacha regarding tumura? There's no halacha of tumura by a carbon owned by partners, as Rashi over here brings. It's a Mishnah, Masechta Tumura, the first Mishnah, that there's no din of tumura by shutfin, because if you look in the parsha, in the parsha of Tumura, it says everything over there, B'loshin Yachid. So we know that the whole din of Tumura is only for an individual. So therefore, this explains that why when the children are yashing the carbon, there's no tumura, because they do acquire it and they become shutfin, so there's no tumura. But if you say that the children are not going to acquire this carbon from their father, so there should be a din of tumura that should apply here. It's not owned by shutfin. So we basically have a contradiction now here in two statements of Rabbi Yochanan. On one hand, Rabbi Yochanan is saying that by the carbon mincha, the children could bring the carbon mincha, which indicates that the children are not yashning it as a shutfin, because mincha cannot be brought by shutfin. On the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan is saying regarding the din of tumura that the children cannot do any, the tumura will not take effect, which indicates that they are yashning it as shutfin. So the Gemara answers, no, Shani Hassam, the truth is, the first statement of Rabbi Yochanan that implies that the children do not yashin it, that is correct. But however, why are we saying over here that there's no din of tumura? If they're not shutfin, so why shouldn't there be a din of tumura? Because there's a pasuk for this. Shani Hassam by tumura, the pasuk, the Amakra, it says, Im Homer Yomer, the double lashon, and if you will exchange. So what's the double lashon? Rabbi says Hayirish. That this comes to include that even a Yerush, after the father died, and you have this carbon there, the Yerush could do tumura for a carbon. However, but the pasuk says, Echad Meimer ve'ein shnayim emirim, because it says that B'loshen Yachid, when do we say that there's a din of tumura that will take effect by a Yerush? That's only if it's one Yerush and not two. If there's two Yerushim, there's no din of tumura. So the point there is not because they're shutfin. It's not what it is. They don't own it. So you can't say an Indian of shutfis. But still, the pasuk says that when does the Indian of Tumura apply? When there's Yerushim, which do not own it, only if it's one Yerush. Not if it's two Yerushim, and that's because the lashon of the pasuk that it says in a singular term. So therefore, we go back that really the first point of what Rabbi Yochanan said is true, that what we learned from there, that children do not acquire the carbon of their father, and therefore they cannot bring a carbon mincha. Again, what the first statement that Rabbi Yochanan said, that you could bring the carbon mincha. They can bring the carbon mincha because they are not shutfin, and so the carbon mincha, which has to be brought by an individual, could still be brought. The Gemara now asks on this side question over here regarding this limud of Homer Yomer, that we're learning from this that it doesn't apply to shutfin because it says it in a singular term. Maskef la Rav Yaakov Nahar Pakoit. Rav Yaakov asks on this, Elomayata, if that's how you darshan the singular term regarding this pasuk, so how about Gabi Meiser? When it comes to redeeming Meiser, the Chsiv, the pasuk there also uses a similar double lashon with a singular term. Vim goel yigal. If you will redeem, it says again the term redeem the Meiser. So the rabbi says a Yerush. It comes to say that a Yerush could also redeem the Meiser. We're talking over here about redeeming Meiser Sheni. The halacha is that the owner that redeems his Meiser, he has to add a fifth to this. So it says this double lashon. So are you going to say, so hachanami, are you going to darshan here as well that echad goyel, that only one person could redeem this meiser, ve'ein shnayim goyelim, but if there's two children that are yarshaning the meiser, they cannot redeem this meiser. So the Gemara here says that can't be. We never heard of such a kind of din that when there's two children that inherit the meiser, they cannot redeem it. But why shouldn't we darshan the same like we just darshaned Homer Yomer? So the Gemara answers, no, over here by Meiser, it's not mistaber to darshan this way. Shani Meiser, because Meiser is different. The Gabi Avuin Nami Yisrael B'Shutfis. Meiser, even by the father, before you talk about Yerush, even by the father, if it's owned in partnership, a field that's owned in partnership, and you have the partners that want to redeem it, so the same halacha applies that they have to redeem it and add a fifth to this. So we don't find that there's any miyut regarding the father that he can't redeem it b'shutvis and then adding a fifth to this. So therefore, even regarding the Yerushim, we're not going to darshan the lashon of the pasuk to exclude two children that Yarshim that they're not going to be able to redeem it this way. Okay, but Mashenkin, when it comes though to Tumura, the reason why we're darshaning Tumura this way, in Homer Yomer, we're focusing on the lashon Yachid there, is because the whole parsha is written by lashon Yachid, and we don't find a din of Tumura by Shutfin. And therefore it's saying that by the children that inherit, even though they're not be'emes shutfin, because they don't even own it, but nevertheless we're dashing the lashon yachid here to say that if there are two children that are yarshim, there's no din of tumura. Okay, but now the Gemara goes back to the inyan of tumura itself. Amalei Ravasi asks Ravashi about this, but umina. But on this itself, though, there's a proof over here. L'chayri, you should say that it must be that the children do yarshin this behemoth. They do get a kinyan in it. Why? Because if you're going to say they acquire this behemoth through the Yerusha, so hainu the chad miyameimer. then you could explain why one child that's a Yiddish could do Tmura. And not two, one, but one could. But and as the Gemara will explain over here, the Gemara now is going to bring actually a third statement from Rabbi Yochanan that Tmura, who is the one that could do Tmura of a carbon? Only the owner of the carbon that's getting the kapara for this carbon. So over here, regarding this Tmura, what did we say? The Gemara was suggesting to say the children don't yarshin it. So if there's two children, they can't do Tmura because of the lashon of the pasuk, Hame Yamer Lashon Yachid. But if it was one child, then you could do Tmura. But if you're saying that they don't own it, the whole inyan of Tmura should not apply here, B'chlal. But if you're going to say that they do not acquire this carbon that they're yashining from their father, Heichi Meimer. How is the B'chlal, the whole concept of Tmura here, even if it's only one child? There's another statement that Rabbi said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And here there's also a few halachas, and there's one halacha regarding Tmura that's relevant for what we're talking about. So first halacha he said is Hamakdish Ma'isiv Chaimish. A person that was Makdish a carbon, and he's being Makdish the carbon not for himself, for his friend, for someone else, that his friend is going to use it for his kapara. So now if he wants to redeem this, so if the one that was makdish it is the one that's redeeming it, he has to add a chaimish. That's only after it has a mum. You're able to redeem it. But if it's the one that's makdish it, that's redeeming it, he has to add a chaimish. But if his friend that he was makdish it for him, it's going to be a kapara for him. If he wants to redeem it, he does not have to add a fifth. The fifth is only the one that's makdish it. Now, umiskaper, but on the other hand, the one that's actually getting the kapara from this, so the friend, in other words, that's getting the kapara, oiset tmura. He's the one that the halacha of tmura will apply to him. Because by the halacha of tmura, the Gemara in Tmura learns this out, that only the one that's getting the kapara, he owns the carbon, and he's getting the kapara of the carbon, by him, the halacha of tmura applies. Another halacha Rabbi Yochanan said, it's not related here, if you are separating meiser from your produce for your friend's produce, the hana that you have from this, that you could choose which kain to give to, that the one that's giving the truma has that option, has that taiva. Okay, so now, what's the Gemara's question? So we see here, Rabbi Yochanan amongst these statements said that there's no concept of tmura if you are not the one that's getting the kapara of the carbon, if it's not, you don't have the ownership of this carbon for a kapara for you. So if we're saying over here that the Yarishim do not yarshin the carbon, like we proved from the first statement of Rabbi Yochanan, that therefore by a carbon mincha, the children can bring the carbon mincha, even though it's more than one child, there's no issue of shutfes by the carbon mincha. So how over here are we saying regarding Tmura that there's a din of Tmura for the Yarishim B'chlal? So the Gemara answers that mikiva loy mechapra. It's true that for the Yarishim there's no established and full-fledged kapara, because they're not really the owners of this carbon. However, even then, mikufya mechapra, there is this hovering kind of kapara. There is somewhat of a kapara, the fact that they are the Yarishim, even if they're not the real owners of the carbon. So therefore, regarding the carbon mincha, before we say they're not the real owners, so there's no owners of shutvis in this carbon mincha, so they can bring the carbon mincha. But regarding the din of tmura, where Rabbi Yochanan said that miskaper, oisa tmura, the one that's getting a kapara, only he could do only by him the halachas of Tmura applies. Even this smaller level of kapara, this kapara mikufya, this hovering kapara, is enough to say that the din of Tmura would apply to the Yarshim if it's one Yiddish. If it's one, as it says in the lashon of the pasuk, a lashon yachid. Okay, so the conclusion of the Gemara is that a Yiddish does not get an ownership over the carbon. So you can't say that when a Yardish brings the carbon that it should be a kapara for his mitzvah seseh. It's not because he's not really the owner of the carbon. And therefore, the point that Abba Lazar said before, that when a person dies, or when a Yeledis dies, and the children bring the carbon, that this is a case where the carbon is kosher, but there's no kapara for the Yarishim themselves. They're not being yaitz any chiyuv for themselves with it. This is a good example for this concept. That's the maskan of the Gemara.
But you think there is a kapara klusha?
Yeah, it's a different type of kapara though. It's still a good example because it's only a psashtikal kapara that is qualifies for the din of tmura, but not a real regular kind of kapara at all. Okay, now
the chayt is only by a carbon, not because the Yerush is Yarshin. It's his now.
Yeah, correct. But
only
the carbon though is a question of ownership. Yeah, dafka by carbon is this kind of question. Correct. Okay, now because the Gemara brought up before this inyan of a carbon oila, that it's also a kapara, not like a kapara of a chatos, but it's miratze. For what? For a mitzvah saseh. A carbon chatos is a kapara for an aveda b'sheigig that you have kares on, but this is also a meratza for mitzvah. So the Gemara has an ibai about this. Ibai elohu, the shaila was asked, kipru alma. Oh, sorry, I jumped a step ahead. Okay, what I just was makdim is the next ibai of the Gemara, ibai elohu aesa. Okay, but here the Gemara actually has a fundamental ibai regarding the halach of the Mishnah. The halach of the Mishnah that says that the carbon itself is kosher, even when you had a kavanah shalei lishma. But for the chayva of the bailin, for the obligation of the person, it won't work. He's going to have to bring another carbon. Oh, so on this, the Gemara has the following shaila. Yibayalu, the shaila is, kipru alma shabo, will this carbon that you're continuing to bring and it's still kosher, will it bring an atonement for the owner that brought it? Which would mean that it will be a kapara for him, but he still has the obligation to bring another carbon. Or not only does he have an obligation to bring another carbon because this was shalei lishma, but it's not even a kapara at all. There's no kapara b'chlal. So the Gemara is dividing this. It could be that he still has a chayva to bring another carbon, but the first carbon did bring a kapara. Rashi says the only nafkamina. There's no practical nafkamina over here in the ibai of the Gemara. The only practical nafkamina, or sort of practical nafkamina, is whether the person should be concerned that he has to still do tshuva because he may get yisurim, he may still get a einish until he brings his next carbon because the kapara did not take effect yet. Or no, the kapara took effect, but he still has a chiv to bring another carbon. That's the shaila. How do we understand? This is a fundamental shaila regarding the halach of the Mishnah that he still has to bring another carbon. So Omer Rav Sheishes, or the Gersa the Bach here says, Omer Rav Sheisha, Berei de Ravidi, Mistavre de Loi Kipro. It's logical to say that since he has to bring another carbon, so the first carbon was not mechaper at all, because the Yisal Kedaitach Kipro. If you're going to say that the first carbon does bring an atonement for him, so Sheni Lamahu Ba. So why is he bringing the second carbon? Why should there be a chayv to bring another carbon if the whole point of the carbon was the kapara and it was mechaper already? So now, ve'elamai, but the question though then becomes the opposite. So what are you going to say? Like kipru, the first carbon is not mechaper for the person. So lama hu karev. So then why is the carbon being brought at all? Yeah, you said the carbon is kosher and the carbon can be brought, but for the owner it accomplishes nothing. No kapara at all. So then what's the point of the first carbon being brought? So memanav shach, the Gemara here is asking, how do we understand this halacha that the carbon is kosher, but it's not going to be mechaper for the owner? So the Gemara explains, Amar Ravashi, Rav Sheisha Berei de Ravidi, Hachika Kashile. Rav Sheisha Berei de Ravidi, this is the question that he had. And he really understood that you must say that it's not mechaper for the owner at all. The question is why it's being brought. That could be explained. Because now, if you're going to say that it's not mechaper for the owner at all, so now to explain why the carbon is still being brought, that's simple. Because shalei lishma, even though now the carbon is already problematic carbon because it was brought shalei lishma, but mikayach lishma kasi, you could continue bringing it since it was originally designated lishma for the carbon. So even though now there was a machshava shalei lishma in the aveda that was done, and therefore it won't work for the chayva or even for the kapara of the bailim, but you continue bringing it because it started off with lishma. As long as it started off lishma, there's something to this carbon that it's still kosher to be brought. So that explains why the first carbon is brought. But then v'sheni lama huba, or the Bach takes out v'sheni huba lechaper, and then the second carbon is being brought because there was no kapara yet, so it's being brought for a kapara, for the owner. So we can understand why the first carbon is being brought, since it started off lishma. So even if in the middle, shalei lishma got mixed in, but we bring it for the original lishma that it was designated for, and we can explain why the second carbon is brought, because he still needs a kapara. But if you're going to say that it's mechaper for the owner, even after the shalei lishma, so sheni lamu uba, why would you say that? Oh, it's mechaper, but he still has an obligation to bring a second carbon. Why would he have an obligation to bring a second carbon if there's a kapara? So therefore, the pshat in the Mishnah is that it's not a kapara at all for the first carbon.
We learned that it's an adava.
And a chanami, yeah. But it looks like even after that drasha, the Gemara still has a disibaya, l'chayra from the lashon of the pasuk. It's like a mashma, that's a pure nadava. Well, that's the maskan of the Gemara here. That it's
a chatos nadava. It's an interesting because it stays a chatos and it's.
Oh no, but the maskan of the Gemara is the first. Oh, 1 second. The first carbon is in the nadava. Yeah.
It stays a chatos, but it's not mechaper, and it just has the din of a nadava.
Yeah, the first carbon is in the nadava, correct. Okay, now the Gemara goes to the Ibaya that I started mentioning before regarding the carbon oila that's brought for a mitzvah saseh. So what's the story with this, that it could be mechaper on a mitzvah saseh? Ibaya lahu, the shaila was as follows. A'eseh the la'achar hafrosha. If the person was already mafresh a carbon, he designated a carbon for a mitzvah saseh to be mechaper for it. But now, after he was already mafresh this carbon, there's another mitzvah saseh that he was over on. Mechapra, will it be mechaper for that essa as well? Or loy mechapra, or it's too late. It's only going to be mechaper on a mitzvah saseh before he was mafresh the carbon. Me, Amrina, what's the basis of the ibaya? Do I say midi dahava chatos? I compare the carbon oila to a carbon chatos. Ma chatos, just like by the chatos, the koyd the mafrosha in the carbon chatos is only mechaper on what the person did before the hafrosh of the carbon. The pasuk there says, "Oy hoy the elov chatosay." Rashi brings there, and then you bring the carbon, not after you were mafresh. The lach hafrosh loy for the after hafrosh, the carbon chatos will not be mechaper. Af hacha nami. So I would say the same thing by the carbon oila. That's going to be mechaper for an esse. The koydem hafrosha in. It's going to atone for what the esse was before he separated this carbon. But lach hafrosh loy, after he separated the carbon, it's not going to be mechaper for this. Or I could say, we don't compare the oila to the chatas. Why not? The chatas, akol chet v'chet, boil asuye, chada chatas. You have to bring a separate carbon chatas for each aveda b'shoigig. But v'hacha, when it comes to the oila, kiven the I, ikke, kama esse, gabei, mechapra, just like the halacha by the carbon oila is that one carbon oila can be mechaper for more than one esse. Actually, he brings the idea of the carbon oila is like a doirain, like a gift that you bring after kapara. It's not a kapara for a naveda b'sheigig, but it's a gift that's being brought, and that gift brings a level of an appeasement. So that gift, if you're bringing a gift to someone, so then it could be mechaper on a lot of things, and everything together. So maybe I should say over here that this oila could be mechaper even for what he was, for the essa after he was separated the carbon already. Also be mechaper. Tashama, so the Gemara brings a raya from what it says. So the price says, so the pasuk says, v'samach v'nirtza. The pasuk there says that he does v'samach. The whole pasuk is v'samach yodeh al reisha oila. You do smicha, where you lean with your whole might on the animal, on the head of the animal, and then v'nirtza l'chaparol. There will be a kapara for him. So the Bryce asks the question that how could he say this? Is it the smicha that's the source of the kapara? We know that the main kapara, the atonement of a carbon, is the spraying of the blood on the mizbeach. Shenemar ki adam hu banefesh. The dam, that's the life of the animal. Yechaper, that's the source of the kapara. So how does it say that the smicha is the kapara? The smicha is the source of the appeasement that brings the kapara. So what it's saying is as follows. If the person treated this smicha just as a leftovers of a mitzvah, meaning he didn't consider it to be important, so he didn't do the smicha. That's what it means. The pasuk considers it as if there was no kapara here, but the chipper. But there actually is a kapara. So there's like two things at the same time. On one hand, we say it's not a kapara because he didn't do the smicha. That's what the pasuk says. V'nirtza, you must do the smicha for the. But on the other hand, the kippur, he did a carbon with the zrika. It will be mechaper. So now, how do we understand this? What does this mean? The Bachir adds in. The Gemara asks is a little bit different than the lashon of the Gemara. My kippur or my loy kippur? What does it mean when it says that on one hand it is an atonement, but on the other hand it's not an atonement? So don't you think the pshat over here is essa the kaidam afrosha? What did he bring the carbon oila for? He's bringing this carbon oila to be mechaper for an essa that he was over on before he separated this carbon. So on that, I say, loy kippur. No, sorry, again. This is the way you read this is. The kippur, say one second there with the bach over here. My love, don't you think the pshat over here is? That's how you have to read it. Yeah, okay. So because you have to add in what the bach says. My kippur or my like kippur. Okay, that's the addition of the bach. And then you start again or you read it as follows. My love, don't you think the pshat over here is the kippur? This that I say that it is mechaper. What is this on? Esa the kaidam afrasha. That means what he separated it for. For any acid that he was over on before he separated the carbon. Now, what does loy kippur mean? Loy kippur means esa the smicha. This itself, that he just missed the smicha of this carbon. After he separated the carbon already, and he missed this smicha, it's on that it's not mechaper. Why not? Because the Havile Esa, the Lacha Frosha. Because when is he being over on this Esa that he did not do the smicha after he already separated it as a carbon? That's the pshat of kippur like kippur. Kippur on everything before the Frosha, but on this smicha, since it's now after the Frosha, on that it's not mechaper. So I see over here that they can't be mechaper for an Esa after the Frosha. So Rava says there's no proof from here. Esa, the smicha ka'amris, you're proving it from here that regarding this that he was over, then he did not do the smicha. So on this is what you want to prove from that on the Esa after the hafrasha, it's not going to be mechaper. Shani asam, this smicha is different. The chol kama deloy shachit, as long as he does not shech the carbon yet, ba'amoid usmoich koi. He always still has that mitzvah to do the smicha until the very last second when you do the actual shchita. So therefore, Amos kohave ese. When is he over on this ese? La'acha shchita. Only after the shchita, then is when he's over this ese. La'acha shchita, lekami boyalon. There's never a shaila to say that this carbon should be mechaper on an ese that he's being over on after the shchita. So that's why this Bryce is saying that it's not going to be mechaper on this that he missed the mitzvah saseh of the smicha. However, Rav Huna bar Yehuda says to Rava, I can tell you the pshat of the lashon of this brayse. When it says kippur and loy kippur, it's the pshat is different. I could say kippur gavra. What it's saying is that the person has a kapara on every esed that he was over, and he's, like Rashi says, that means that he will not have any punishment, any yisurim. And the Shit Mekabetz here adds this would mean it's mechaper on everything, even on this that he missed this smicha as well. You could also say that maybe it's mechaper. Now, what does it mean when it says loy kippur? Loy kippur means kabei shmaya. For heaven, though, it's not a full kapara. It'll save him from yisurim, but to be a nachas ruach l'kainoi, which Rashi says mitzvah min amufcha, it's not a mitzvah min amufcha. He didn't do the smicha. That's this expression of kippur and loy kippur. And it brings an example where we find this inyan. Milay Tanan, haven't we learned in a Mishnah, where it speaks about the oil that has to be put on the mitzayre. There's oil that has to be placed on his fingers, and then there's the oil that afterwards the pasuk says v'hanoiser b'shemen, that the leftover oil. What has to be done? The pasuk says ashal kafa kayin, so yitain al roish shamitay. You have to pour it on the head of this mitzayre that's becoming pure. L'chaper olav or it says in the pasuk there lashon v'chiper olav hakayin lefnei Hashem. Okay, so now the Brisa says about this when it says v'hanoiser. It says about this oil that you have to pour on him that's it's leftovers. So im nasan kippur, if you pour it on him, it's going to be a kapara. If you don't pour this leftover oil on him, then it won't be a kapara. You have to do the whole thing over again. That's what Rabbi Akiva says. However, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, Shiyare mitzvah. These are the remnants of a mitzvah, because the pasuk uses this term v'hanoisar, and therefore I say bein nitin ben shaloi nitin. Whether you pour this oil on this mitzvah or not, kippur, it's going to be a kapara for him. But umaylin olav keilu loy kippur. However, it's considered as if there wasn't a kapara. So what does this mean? We said it is a kapara, but then we're saying that it's as if it's not. So don't you think, what does it mean when it says as if it's not a kapara? If you're going to say it's saying that it's like it's not a kapara at all, and he has to bring another carbon all over again for the mitzayra. But Rabbi Yochanan starts off saying that it is a kapara, whether you pour the oil or not, because the pasuk uses this term v'hanaisa. So Ella over here, you see that you could touch, like we said before. Kippur means gavra, that the person here below has the kapara, this mitzvah is now pure. But like Kippur kapishmaya, the Gabi the Eibishter, it wasn't done, the mitzvah wasn't done in Amufcha, wasn't done in the best way. So Hachanami, that's the pshat over here in the brayse that we brought before regarding the person that did not do smicha, Kippur chulu, like the same thing that we said before, that it's not a kapara, it's a kapara for the person, but not klapishmaya. Okay, but the Gemara says this Mishnah that we're bringing here from the Mitzayda, you don't necessarily have to touch over there that there's a distinction between for the Gavra here below and Klapi Shmaya. Over there you can touch differently. Hasam Nami over there I can tell you Kippur means Matam Bahinis. This that you have to place the blood on his fingers, that will be a kapara for him. That does not have to be done over again. But like Kippur, Matnas Araish. However, the Matnas Araish that you did not pour on his head, that was not done, and that wasn't mechaper. You're going to have to bring again the lug of oil, a certain measure of oil, and do it over again. That's what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. So Rabbi Akiva holds you have to do everything over again. Even what you place on his fingers also has to be done over again. But Rabbi Yochanan is saying what you did for the fingers is already done. Not all you have to do over again is pour the oil on his head. Therefore, it's a different pshat. It's not a proof for the pshat that the Gemara is saying here. Toshima, the Gemara goes back to the main shaila regarding the mitzvah saseh. Could a carbon oil be mechaper on a mitzvah saseh that one was over after he was already mafresh the carbon? So it says in a brayse, Reb Shimon says, Kivsei atzeres lo mein baim. The lambs that are brought on Shavuos, for what are they being brought for? That's the question. Now, the Gemara interjects right away and says that can't be what Reb Shimon was addressing. Kivsei atzeres. You're asking about the kivsei atzeres shlomim? No, it's a carbon shlomim. Shlomim is not mechaper for anything. It's a shlomim that's brought together with the breads. So there's no question of what it's being mechaper for. So Ella, his question was seire atzeres lo mehem baim. What is the kapara of the goats that are brought on Shavuos? And this is not only on Shavuos, but every carbon there's the seirim that are brought. What is a kapara for? But over here on Shavuos, there's two seirim that are brought. What is a kapara for? Al tumas mikdash v'kadoshav. It comes to be mechaper for tumeh in the Beis HaMikdash and eating kachim. So this is the Gemara we learned in the beginning of Shavuos. It's in a case where the person is not even aware of this whole tumah altogether. He doesn't know, not in the beginning and not after. There's no awareness of this. So the kapara for this is from the karbanis of Yom Tiv and Shavuos. It's the seirim that are mechaper for this tumah. Okay, so now the thing though is, there's two goats that are brought. If it's a kapara for this aveira, why do you need two? So nizrak dam shel risha, once you spray the blood of the first one, so sheni lama karev. Why are you bringing a second carbon or another goat, which is a kapara for the same thing? So the Rav Shimon explains, al tumeh she'ura ben zelazeh, because if there's tumeh between the first and the second, so then that could be a kapara even for that moment, for that little time in between that someone came into the Beis HaMikdash tameh and he doesn't know, it'll be mechaper as well. Now the Braisa adds to this, from here you can learn out that we see that we're mamish bringing a second carbon just for a little time in between, to be mechaper for that really that really Yidden should be bringing karbanis constantly to be mechaper for every time, every moment, or every few minutes, whatever it is, that there could be another situation of an Aveda that someone came into the Beis HaMikdash tamei or ate kachim when he's tamei. Elo shechasach hakasav. The Torah avoids this, or it has rachmanis on us, and it's mechaper. The Eibush is not medactic so much. Rashi says chasam ma'mainam. The Eibush has rachmanis on the money of a yid, and it doesn't make us bring so much karbanis. But you see, really, be'emes, you have to bring one kapara, and right afterwards another kapara for this tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Okay, but now here, what's the point? The esed, the lacha afrosha. Over here, this tumah that happens in between, this is a mitzvah saseh. Rashi brings the pasuk, v'yishalchum and amachim. This is a mitzvah saseh, not to be metame and come into the Beis HaMikdash. Now, what are we saying? That the second carbon, the second goat, is going to be mechaper for any tumah that happens in between. Now that's being mechaper after the hafrasha, because when was he mafresh this carbon? He was mafresh this carbon already from before Yom Tiv, from yesterday. And still I say that's going to be mechaper for this mitzvah saseh that someone was over walking to the Beis HaMikdash tummy. So I see that there's a kapara for a mitzvah saseh that you're over after you separated the carbon already. So the Gemara says there's no proof from here. If the case is that it was mafresh, he designated these two goats for the carbon at the very same time. So al chanami, you're right that it wouldn't be mechaper separately for any tumah in between. There is no in between. It was mafresh them both together. What is this Braisa referring to? Not that it's going to be mechaper after he was mafresh. He was mafresh one carbon, and then later on he was mafresh another carbon. And what it's saying is, why are two goats being brought as a carbon to be mechaper on the tumah of the kachim? That mitzvah saseh of the tumah of the kachim in between the two times that you designated or that you separated it. But for any tumah that would happen afterwards, it wouldn't be mechaper. Okay, but the Gemara asks on this answer is a very big deichik. V'leiku v'leimele lekra. Are we coming and establishing and saying that this pasuk is speaking about only one specific case? The chi ksiva bezeh chazek ksiva. When the pasuk says that you have to bring the two goats for the carbon on Shavuos, it's tafke. The point of the two goats is only in a case where it was mafresh one, and then later where it's mafresh the other. But if he's mafresh it at the same time, then there's really no point of the two goats. It's a big deichik to say that that's what the pasuk is coming to say. So the Gemara gives another answer. Amar Rav Papa, so Rav Papa says, Karbonis Tzibuka Amrit. You're bringing me a proof from these goats that are being brought on Shavuos, which is a carbon tzibur for the whole Klal Yisrael together. Over there is a different story. Shani Karbonis Tzibur. When it comes to carbon tzibur, it's a different thing. Why? Because I can tell you, the Lev Bezdin Kamasna Aleyan. There's the heart of the Bezdin that takes control of all the matters of the Tzarchi Tzibur. They make a condition. And that is, what's the condition? That the second carbon, even though you were mafresh already before, the hafrasha should not take effect. And when is the hafrasha going to take effect? A moment before the actual carbon is brought. Why? So that it should be mechaper on any additional mitzvah saseh of tumah that happened in between. So really, it's mechaper on the mitzvah saseh from before the hafrasha. Because the lev bezna is masna. That it should not take effect until then. That's by the carbon tzibur. And therefore there's no right to what we're talking about over here, to whether a carbon could be mechaper on an essay afterwards. Now the Gemara brings a source for this, because Rav Yehuda Mashmuel. Rav Yehuda Mashmuel said this idea, Rav Yehuda Mashmuel, karbonis tzibur, when you have the karbonis tzibur, now what this is talking about is, you have the karbonis tzibur of the entire year. Every carbon tamid is brought from the funds of the matzah shekel of that year. What happens if there's leftover karbonis tzibur, leftover animals of the carbon tamid of this year? What do you do with these karbanis? So one of the options is that it could be brought the following year, but the karbanis tamid of the following year has to be from the funds of the machzas shekel of the next year. So now the leftovers of these karbanis will be brought for what's called kayetz hamizbeach, dessert for the mizbeach, when the mizbeach is empty. So when the carbon is brought, even though originally it was intended to be for a carbon tamid, but these karbanis tzibur sakin mishchasan lema shehein. The knife that's used to shecht and bring the carbon, it will establish then to change it from what it was in the beginning to be a carbon tamid to now be a carbon for kayetz mizbeach. So how does it change it? So according to the way the Gemara is saying this here, the reason it changes it is with the lev bezdin masna. This is because the bezdin lechatchila makes a condition that if it won't be needed for the carbon tamid of this year, and now we're using for the carbon tamid the funds of the new year, so now the carbon will be brought for something else, for kayetz hamizbeach. That's the girsa that we have it over here in our Gemara, that this halacha of sakim mishchasan regarding these karbonis tzibur is also based on lev bezdin masna. But Rashi here says that nira not to be guided is this, nira be'ena, that we're not guided is this part of here of Rav Yehuda Mashmuel, because as we'll see from the continuation of the Gemara, it's mashma that this whole Indian of the sakim mishchasan has nothing to do with lev bezdin masna alein. It's a separate Indian. You don't need the special kayach of the bezdin over here for this. Okay, let's see the continuation of the Gemara. Amalei Rav Yosef Berei, Rav Shmuel, Rav Papa. So basically, Rav Shmuel asks Rav Papa on his answer. Rav Papa is saying that over here by karbonis tzibur, there's a concept of lev bezdin masna that the bezdin holds up the afrasha of the second goat, so that it could be mechaper on additional mitzvah saseh that someone came to the Beis Hamikdash tameh. So what me is Rav Shimon live bezdin masna. We're saying all this as a pshat in the Braisa where it was Rav Shimon speaking. Does Rav Shimon hold b'chlal of this concept that there's a lev bezdin masna lein that it's the heart of the bezdin that's making a condition to hold up the hafrash of the carbon? But that can't be, because and this is going back again to this case of this carbon tamid, the leftover carbon tamid of 1 year. The carbon tamid that was not needed for the tzibur of that year. So what's done with it? L'divrei Rab Shimon, according to Rab Shimon's opinion, ein nifdin tmimin. It cannot be redeemed when it's still a complete behemoth. The halacha b'chlal by kachim is you cannot redeem kachim that has a kedushas haguf on it, the body of it is a carbon, can't redeem it unless it has a mum. Right, so Rab Shimon says the same thing applies to this carbon tamid. It was already designated and it has a kedushas haguf to be a carbon tamid from the year before. You cannot now redeem it if it's still a carbon that's tamim. However, Chachamim say that it could be redeemed even if it's a carbon before it has any mum. What's the reason for this? Because Chachamim say that there's a lev bezdin masna lein. What's the lev bezdin masna lein? That the Chachamim hold up, the bezdin is holding up the kedushas haguf of the behemoth, that it doesn't really take effect. And therefore, if there's no Kedushas Haguf, any kachim that doesn't have Kedushas Haguf, it's just the Kedusha of the value of the money of it, you could be paided, you could redeem it, even if it's a tam. You don't have to wait until it has the mum. Now Rab Shimon that argues on this, what does Rab Shimon say? the Bezdin doesn't have the power, doesn't get involved to this extent to say that the Kedusha is held up, that there's no Kedusha Saguf, and therefore you can redeem it when it's still Tam. No, it has a full Kedusha Saguf, and therefore you cannot redeem this. So if so, we see that Rab Shimon does not hold of this concept of Lev Bezdin Masna Alein. Okay, so now, as I pointed out, this is the reason why before, when the Gemara brought Lev Bezdin Masna Alein regarding this Inyan, there's another option. Right? There's another option, what could be do with the leftover Karbanis Tamid, without redeeming it, just to bring it for Kayet Samizbeach. So before, in the simple shot of the Gemara, it was saying that that's also based on Lev Bezna Masna Lein. So there's sort of like a contradiction here in the Gemara. Right now the Gemara is saying that Rab Shimon does not hold of Lev Bezna Masna Lein. Therefore there's no option to redeem it before it has a mum. And before the Gemara was saying that this concept that it's brought for Kayet Samizbeach is based on Lev Bezna Masna Lein. That's the reason why Rashi said to take it out. But there is some that Mefarshim, and there's a Taisvis here, and there's a whole arichas about this that says that you can keep it in, and because there's two different levels to this inyan of Lev Bezdin Masna Aleim. To what extent does Bezdin get involved? And you could say that the Tnai of the Bezdin is to use the carbon for something else, for Kayet Samizbeach. But here we want to use the Lev Bezdin Masna Aleim to a much greater extent. You want to say that it's as if this carbon doesn't have any Kedusha Saguf B'chlal, doesn't have any real holiness in the body of it. It only has a kedusha is domim, and therefore you can redeem it even without a blemish. That's a much more powerful thing of Lev Bezna Masna Alein. And the Gemara here is saying, if you want to tell me for Rab Shimon that the carbon is going to be mechaper for an esse, and it's still considered to be like koidem afrosha, because Bezdin makes a t'nai that the afrosha of the carbon only happens later. That means that you're saying that it's like not a carbon yet. That's what we wanted to say regarding the two goats, that the whole afrosha only happens a moment before the shechita, so it could be mechaper before. So you need the higher inyan, a more powerful inyan of Lev Bezdin Masna, that it's as if it's not a carbon yet at all. That's what the Gemara is asking here. Even if you want to be guided before, it's saying that this higher level of Lev Bezdin Masna Alein, that it's like not a carbon at all. Rab Shimon doesn't hold it at. Rab Shimon says you can't redeem it, Tmimim. Okay, let's just finish the inyan over here. The Gemara asks, additionally, I'll ask you another question over here. And this is going back b'chlal to the Gemara before suggested another teretz. Before Lev Bezdin Masna, the Gemara suggested to say that over here, what was the first answer of the Gemara? That it's talking about a case where he was mafreshit, and then the hafrasha of the two goats were done at different times. So you can't bring a raya from here to the question that we're discussing. But the Gemara here says, we know that Rabbi Yirmiyah asked from Rabbi Zera the following shaila regarding these two goats that are brought in Shavuos. These two goats that he shechted them at the very same time, and he was makabel the blood of both of them in two vessels at the very same time. And now the blood of the first goat was sprayed on the mizbeach. Why are we bringing spraying the blood of the second one? You have one, and you shechted it at the same time, and now you already sprayed the blood of one, so what do you need the second one for? That was the shaila that Rabbi Yirmiyah asked. And he said, that is because of any tumah that happened between the zrika of the first and the zrika of the second, so that's why I have to have another kapara to spray the blood of the second goat to be mechaper. That was the shaila of Rabbi Yirmiyah, and Rabbi Zera clarified that there would be it's a shaila really. It's really an iboy. He's asking, is it for the tumah that happened between these two zrikas? So now, what does the Gemara say? What do you see over here? What I see here is the discussion between Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Zera is if there's a tumah, you are over on an essa already after the shechita of this carbon, and now you sprayed the blood of one and you didn't spray the blood of the other. So you want to know whether it could be mechaper, the zrika could be mechaper, even though the shechita was done already. The essa that one is over after he designated the carbon, that wasn't even a shayla b'chlal. So what the Gemara is saying is, we're discussing essa after afrosha. It seems over here that there's even a discussion on a much later point, even after the shechita, before the zrika. So why are you even having any baya about the hafrosha? So the Gemara says that's not a shaila. Dilme imtim tzaleima ka'amar. This whole discussion between Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Zera is the imtim tzaleima. What does imtim tzaleima mean? Really, there's an baya a step before. Could the carbon be mechaper even after the hafrosha? Maybe that's too late. If you're going to say that it is mechaper after the hafrosha, so then Rabbi Yirmiyah is asking Rabbi Zera whether you could say that even at a later point that it would be mechaper after the Shechita as long as it's before the Zrike. But really, both of them remains an Ibaya, and the Gemara here does not resolve this Ibaya.